Well, Sabrina, as folks join us, I'm going to kick it off and just really quickly give an overview of your background, and we can get started and get into the conversation. So 30,000 foot level here, what we're here to chat about, and thank you folks for joining us, is to talk through how Zipcar's created a diverse network through public partnerships. Particularly interesting too in the context of the year that we've had and how those partnerships have been growing across the country. So Sabrina joins us with a fantastic experience in public partnerships, in policy and corporate communications. In her current role, she collaborates with leading cities, policymakers, organizations, and members of the media to accelerate the growth of car sharing as a vital, sustainable part of the urban transportation ecosystem. Before coming to Zipcar, Sabrina was a senior policy advisor for Mayor de Blasio, worked on behalf of the mayor with federal agencies, city agencies, and congressional offices. Her portfolio included federal policy and appropriations work on transportation, housing, infrastructure, city planning, and economic development. I see a very, very short list there. Sabrina's career started at the Department of Transportation, working as the special assistant to the Undersecretary for Transportation Policy before moving on to the role of Vice President for Membership and Development at the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. A proud personal and professional advocate for pedestrian safety and mobility, Sabrina holds a master's in political management from George Washington and a bachelor's in communications from American University. And then on the personal note, we are also really lucky to have Sabrina's sibling, Cyrus, on our Quorum team. He just chatted in that she has a great brother as well. So he's also a very humble sibling, is the big piece of it.
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah, that seems about right. We tolerate him because of his sisters, is what we'll say. But ultimately, we're thrilled to have you and to talk through this. And we're going to have you walk through a couple of slides and kind of an overview. And we want this to be conversational. So folks, go ahead and put questions in the Q&A section as well. And Sabrina, I'm going to hand it on over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashton. And I have to say a special shout out to the Quorum team, because with the exception of perhaps one employee, I have such a fondness for all of the Quorum team because I think the work that you do is so rooted in sort of the people behind our function, right? As someone who's worked in government and around government and with government for a while, it's often easy for people to forget that at the end of the day, you're building products, services, and policies for people. And I think that the Quorum team has just done a really good job of keeping that front and center. The one who shall remain nameless, has a separate list of things we can talk about, but we'll save that for Q&A. So with that, maybe I'll go ahead and jump in and share my screen. Typically, if we were in person, I'd ask everyone to raise their hand, but feel free to throw it in the chat box if you want. I don't know if you've heard of Zipcar, but I'm really here to tell you a little bit about how we use public partnerships as a big tool in our toolbox in improving city living through social and environmental change. And so for those of you who may not know much about Zipcar, beep beep, we are the world's leading car sharing network. And we give members quick, easy, reliable access to a car without the cost and hassle of owning one. And we've actually been at it for a little while, but before we get into that, simply put, we are a mission-driven company. We have been since the start, and this is the crux really of how I define our public partnership models, is we start with our mission to enable simple and responsible urban living. So for those of you who may not have used us before and are looking to use us soon, 3 simple steps: you join, you book a car, and then you drive the car. You can get in either tapping a card or through Bluetooth, just tap the app, drive away, return it to the same spot you picked it up. And as I said, we've been at this for a while. We have more than 1 million members across the globe, 12,000 vehicles in our fleet. 67% of our team has been members with us. We call them Zipsters, so we're one big family. And we are in nearly 500 cities and towns and 500 colleges and universities. So when I said a while, I meant it. We're 21 years in. So imagine this was years before the iPhone even existed. We launched in 2000, and for 21 years now have really reinvented what car sharing and sharing and the sharing economy mean. And we've used that to really think about what the future of mobility looks like. I think we all have questions about the Jetsons and what mobility may look like for our kids and our kids' kids. But if you take one step back, just 2 decades ago, this concept of car sharing, or the idea that you don't have to own a car to have access to one, was pretty crazy. Now it's garnered in a pretty simple factoid, which is for every one Zipcar on the road, we reduce the need for up to 13 personally owned vehicles. And that comes from 2 places. Number one, we own all of our cars. And number 2, all of our trips are round trip, which means you pick it up at one spot and you bring it back. And what that does is it facilitates a special kind of use case that says these trips, they really have to be in cars. They're not happening walking or biking or transit, but really these are car trips for people without cars. And we know that because 75% of our members across North America don't own a car. So let's do a little bit of math. Close your eyes and then open them back up. And what you'll see is a city filled with parking spaces. And throughout COVID, we've seen a transformation of how urban space is used. Just last night, I was driving on Florida Ave in DC and saw the twinkle lights of all the outdoor restaurants, and it gave my heart a little flutter. The idea of being able to sit out on a beautiful spring night and eat in a street that typically was used for car storage is exactly evoking what I want to see. And the reality is that Zipcar already had been enabling this. So instead of the one car parked on the street, you can have one micro unit of housing in that space. You can have 3 office spaces. You can have 5 motor scooters, 12 bicycles, or a really lovely night filled with guac and margs and all of the things that sort of make the springtime so interesting and accessible to urban residents. Now, I sort of want to acknowledge that had we had this conversation 13, 14 months ago, the world would have looked very differently. And I think part of the power of public relationships is that you have to be able to live through some really immense change. And part of what's changed in the last year is how we get around. We did a survey with Engine Insights Group in August, and we learned that 80% of urban dwellers now say it's essential to have access to a car. Now they said it's access, not ownership. And we know that 41% of these same people in the last 6 months have either bought a car or are considering buying one. But of that same group, 63% are concerned about the impact of traffic congestion on the future of city life. Well, how do you sort of square all of that together? Because more cars equals more traffic. One of the things that sort of makes Zipcar who Zipcar is our public partnerships. So we've really pioneered this idea of working with cities, starting by saying, what's your goal? Do you want fewer cars? Do you want decreased CO2 emissions? Do you want faster throughput? Do you want more people walking or biking? What is that goal? And then how can we really partner with you? And so we partner in a lot of different ways, including pilot programs and on-street parking and government fleets and public transit partnerships. But it's this rich network that really enables us to help cities meet their own goals. That's why we're here, and that's how we grow. So I'll do a super quick look into just 2 partnerships I'm particularly proud of. First of which being New York City's Department of Transportation in New York City. We have over 250 on-street parking spaces in collaboration with the city government. In just 1 year alone, there were 70,000 trips taken from just those cars. Our average reservation length was 10 hours. So again, these are not the short trips that are happening just when it's raining or when someone doesn't really want to walk or take a bike. These are trips outside of the city. We know it's a 68-mile average distance, and we're really allowing New Yorkers, who in particular never really want to own a car, to still have access to some of those trips. The other one that I'll briefly highlight is a program in Sacramento, California that we do in conjunction with the Sacramento Air Management Quality District. It's actually a program for fully electric vehicles dedicated to individuals who live in low-income housing. We give them up to 9 hours a week at no cost access to these vehicles. And hearing stories about people sort of saying, this is how I get to the doctor. This is how I get my groceries. This is how I make sure I can get around safely, and I'm doing it in a ZEV vehicle, has really propelled us to start to think again about what that future of mobility really looks like. So if I'm going to take a big deep breath, take a step back. Fundamentally, we believe that once again, we're at a pivotal moment in history to make urban mobility more responsible, equitable, and sustainable. And that by owning less, by having fewer cars, we all actually have access to so much more. And so with that, I'm of course here, I'm super excited to have a conversation and happy to answer any questions that I might be.
Sabrina, thank you. I would love to kind of kick it off with a little bit of a strategic question for you. And if I ever ask a question that's secret sauce, tell me it's secret sauce and we'll move forward. When you're thinking about kind of which organizations or which cities, which localities you want to form these partnerships with, what kind of flags for you? These are areas we want to go into next, or what kind of sets the criteria for who you form those partnerships with?
I think that's a great question. I think, again, when you've been around for 21 years and you're in 500 cities and towns, we're not at a place in our growth where we're looking for net new all the time. What we're looking for is to really deepen and to strengthen. And what makes a good car sharing market is sort of one set of questions. What makes a really good public partnership is another set of questions. And obviously what we've done for 2 decades now is curate to make sure that as many of those markets overlap, so that we're finding markets that are great for car sharing, like New York City, but also really hospitable for public partnerships. And I think, to be honest with you, it comes down to a couple of things. One is you want to work with a city government that knows there is an opportunity to fix. It might be a problem, it might be room for improvement, it might even just be a dream that someone once had that this could be a thing. Because that's really how this all started so many years ago. But when city government is able to define the opportunity ahead and say, you know what, we want fewer cars. We want to make sure that our streets are more safer, are more walkable. Then they're looking for opportunities. And I think that's where we come in. I think one question I often ask cities is, how do we want to see the change that you envision in the world? And how do we, as your partner, help get you the data and the change to help illustrate that? Because at the end of the day, a partnership doesn't really drive value if you don't get to see the change that you've evoked through that. So we spend a lot of time with cities talking about what is the change you want to see? How do we help you facilitate that change?
I imagine there's probably, depending on the city, a little bit of back and forth too, in terms of helping them identify what that change they want to see is. Like it's even like getting them to that answer. I'm sure that there's some kind of narrowing of or refining of a vision that you guys have to go through.
I think that that's absolutely right. And I think part of that, Ashton, is because things change, right? I mean, the conversations I was having in January of 2020 with cities are wildly different than the ones I'm having today. Do they have at the base level the same concerns about accessibility, equality, sustainability, safety? Absolutely. But are the lens in which they're looking to make that change very different? Sure. And I think one of the benefits of sort of being a longtime partner is that we've seen a lot of changes in mobility, right? And that we're able to say, we're here for the distance, and our partnership is meant to ensure that we are a consistent form of mobility for your residents. And that change can be really tough, and you want to be able to scale through some of that. And part of that is a relationship with the city that allows you to sit down and say, what's coming down the pike for the next 6 months, for the next year? Are you seeing changes in commuting patterns or in people moving in and out of the city, or development patterns that are things that are causing you some pause? And then how do we help you manage through that?
I think that's a great segue, kind of when you're thinking about the lens and the change in that lens. I imagine over time, because you've been such long-term partners, you're constantly learning, and the definition of what makes a partnership successful has changed. I'm curious, in the chat, we have a question around like, what have you learned about what makes partnerships work? Is it like, what is sort of those factors that you pay attention to that flag that something is going to be worthwhile? And I imagine they've changed over time.
Yeah, they have. And it's interesting because I think there's a couple ways to answer that question. And Ken, I saw it. I think it's a great question. I think at the end of the day, you want partners who know why they're at the table.
Yeah.
And so when I'm talking to a city, they know why they're there. They know the problem, the opportunity. But I really have to ask myself, like, why am I, Zipcar, here? And if there's another partner, why are they at the table? Because as someone who's worked both in the public sector, actually for most of my career, and then sort of took this journey into Zipcar, which is the private sector, everyone has different things they can bring to the table. And not to take a metaphor too far, but if you sit down at the table and you don't even know why you're there, then how do you know what to put out on the table for others? And so I think for partners, what you're really looking is you want to know what your levers are, and you want to know why that specific partnership is worth it in and of itself. I also think trust is a really big part of that. Zipcar embodies a partnership first model. So we never ask for forgiveness. We always ask for permission, and we do it in conjunction with a public partner. Because again, for us, it's how you know you have their back and they have yours. And so whether it's taking a chance and launching a new neighborhood or expanding a program so that, you know, residents of public housing can have free access, whatever that might be, you sort of want to know that your partner is going to be with you throughout that journey. And that's built off of relationships. And I think all too often in Washington, you know, we sort of joke that it's a small town, big town, but it's true on the local level. Every small town is a big town, small town, like Washington. And I think for folks like your audience who largely at times do state or federal affairs, it's the same philosophy, just applied in hundreds of places around the country.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's a question in the chat here around those partners and what those look like if it's different than a public partner. Like, does Zipcar partner with other modes of travel, transit agencies, airports, rail? And is the approach to partnerships, I'm assuming they're all a little bit nuanced, like different than like a city or a public partnership?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And Bob, I love this because, you know, there's a term in mobility now that has become very she is one way to describe it, which is like mobility hubs, right? Which is this idea that you should co-locate as many different kinds of mobility in one place. And so you might see this practically when a scooter parks next to a metro stop, or bike share has a stop or a dock right next to the metro or a bus line. That in sort of in and of its essence is what a mobility hub is. And we like to joke that sort of we started doing that 2 decades ago when we said, well, there's some secret sauce behind where you put your cars. But for us, all those years ago, it was actually pretty simple. It was, you need to put cars places that people can get to without a car, right? Because if they have a car, they're not driving to get in the Zipcar. So you need to put them in places that have good sidewalk access. You need to put them in places where there are transit stops, where there are bike share, where there are scooter share, where there are bus lines. And that's really how we kicked it off so many years ago, to say, hey, MBTA in Boston, or hey, MARTA in Atlanta, we know that these cars parked at your stations across your network will help people take that second half of the journey. It's not quite last mile, which is a term we use in mobility, but it's sometimes last 68 miles, let's say. And so the sort of fundamentals of the partnership are the same, which is, hey, MARTA, hey, MBTA, why? Why do you want this? And they say, well, because we worry that people think if you're trying to get out of town, you can't still rely on us. And the answer is you absolutely can. You take the train as long as you can, and then you take a Zipcar for that final little stretch. Or, you know, we need to pick up a car and the thought of going all the way to the airport, whatever it might be, this allows sort of that fluidity in mobility that I think is how people naturally think about life. So we embark on those partnerships in the same way, which is, what are your goals? What are our goals? And then we just do an assessment of what is the demand from our members telling us about this partnership.
I'm thinking about the fluidity of mobility. When I started using Zipcar in college, it was like I couldn't afford a car, needed to get from my college campus to the airport to then fly back home to California. So that's definitely very true.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Kevin asked a really interesting question to your answer previously, and sorry for bouncing back here, but talk about the permission forgiveness back and forth. Is that something that you see going both ways, like between the partners and you, and then back to you and the partners? Is that sort of a
that's really
relationship?
That's really interesting. I think certainly there's an element of that that's very deeply rooted in how we understand best practices, right? And so I think about our relationship with New York City. New York City was one of the cities that was sort of last to launch on-street parking, understandably, right? Like New York City is a big and complicated place. And so the thought of converting on-street parking throughout the 5 boroughs was one that seemed a little intimidating.
Yeah, it's daunting.
And so what we actually did is we spent a lot of time sort of answering questions, not just us, but others in the industry. How does it work? What other cities are doing it? Do you have proof? Like, how do you know that this is going to work? And then they built a pilot program. And so I think, Kevin, at the heart of your question is this idea that like, there's never a step that's a little too far, right? That we are very concerned with allowing cities and the private sector to be nimble and to try things and to iterate. And pilot programs are everyone's sort of favorite way to do that because it allows for that degree, I think, of dynamicism that sometimes people think the public sector doesn't have. And the reality is that they do. And part of that back and forth of permission versus forgiveness is that they know that they can call us and say, hey, we're thinking about trying this thing. Have you seen it in any other city? Have you done it before? Is there a reason why this won't work? And for us, that's added so much value because it allows us to say, we have some history here. We have some knowledge. We have some research. Let us share with you.
I think that the pilot concept kind of brings up the not so pleasant idea of also like learning lessons, sometimes the hard way with pilots. And I, by no means do I mean to pick at a scab here, but have there been some tough lessons that you've learned from partnerships that you've kind of taken away, or that you do things differently now based on some of those lessons?
It's funny, I often think about something that if you live in Washington, you may have seen and not really thought much of, which is a lot of our spaces have what we call pavement markings. Like for those in the transportation world, like paint on streets, very sexy topic. We can do a second webinar, Ashton, just on paint on streets.
I'll add that to my wish list.
Please do. Follow up with that.
I'm sure the marketing team, Cyrus, we can have Cyrus moderate that one.
I don't know that would be well attended. Actually, that might be really well attended. Yeah. So we have all of these parking spaces that could be marked on street. And so we do that because we see a higher adherence to posted regulations, which basically means when you were a Zipcar member and you returned your car to its space, once in a while, someone who didn't have a Zipcar would park in that space because they were like, oh, I'll just park here. It'll be fine. It'll be 5 minutes. They won't notice. We've seen is that the adherence to posted regulations is transformed when you put some paint on the street. It's just that simple. And so we've had conversations both with local partners, and I can happily talk about them in New York, where we said, look, this is a really important part of how you build community awareness of the program. And the response was like, well, but that, lots of guttural noises. And so we went without in New York for the first year. And what we saw was that our incidence of blocked spaces were higher. And so New York City sort of said to us, well, we have this block space problem. And I said, yeah, I know. Why don't we try this? And so part of that is don't wait for perfect, right? Be ready and willing to iterate as you go. Because I think so often we want to wait until something is perfect. It's human nature. And the reality is that like, it's okay to have an imperfect solution and to iterate over time.
Yeah.
And I think cities need private partners who are willing to have that conversation with them.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. So if we're kind of staying on the theme of lessons learned here, I imagine there's kind of a back and forth that happens between the lessons learned through the public partnerships and then how you all operate on a policy level, right? Like we learned this worked or doesn't work, and this has big implications for how we feel on certain policies. Have you seen that back and forth happen pretty regularly between public partnerships and how you all think about policy?
I think absolutely. I also think, I'm a bit of a policy nerd. And I think the beauty of policy is that it's meant to be iterative. When I worked at USDOT, my boss had a quote on her wall that someone at OMB at the time had said to her, and someone before him had said to him. And, it's one of those things, which is culture eats policy for breakfast. And at the end of the day, like, that is so true. And, I'm an operator of a transportation service now, right? Like we have cars. COVID hit and we were an essential service, which meant every single day since last year, our employees have masked up and gone out to touch our cars, to talk to our members, to make sure we continue to operate. And I think if we had sat back and said, well, we're waiting for policy, we're waiting to, you can't. Culture says people have to have access to pharmaceuticals, to groceries, to doctors, to all of those essential things. And so you obviously have to remain nimble, and you obviously have to be responsive and safe and all of those things. But at the end of the day, culture is the thing that drives us, particularly when it's as fundamental as how we get around and whether or not we can get around. And so I think there's a really interesting interplay between that. And it's one of maybe my favorite parts of having worked both in the private sector and the public sector, is you see how those two things really come together.
I don't know how I can riff on this, but we did get a question around the rest of the time riffing on MutCD and kerbeus, which I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole, but it sounds like those are terms you're familiar with.
Yeah. Yes. So for those of you who do not know what MutCD is, I will say we have perhaps one of the hippest transportation secretaries we've ever had, in Secretary Mayor Pete Buttigieg, as he likes to go by. And Secretary Buttigieg has made quite a bit of news in the last couple of weeks on a variety of topics. But one of the things that he's also said is that the standards that we've relied on for years and years and years and years on how we mark our streets are not enough. And so there's this book, right? There's a book that says stop signs look like this. Mm-hmm. And a double yellow line means this. Mm-hmm. But then like a broken white line means this. And a red light means this. And a green light means this. All of those, I'm oversimplifying at this point, but all of those things are written in a book and say, these are the standards, because if we don't have one set, the whole thing erupts in chaos, because you have, children who are dressed as adults in adult bodies driving around these very heavy death cars. What happens? You need some form of regulation. Yeah. And so one of the things that Secretary Buttigieg said in recent weeks is that we need to go back to the basics here, and we need to think about, are we building our streets in a way that is all of the things we want, which includes equitable, accessible, sustainable, and most importantly, safe. And so I think part of what fueled this is a realization throughout the pandemic that we give up a lot of space for car storage. I always like to joke that people believe the parking in front of their house is sacred and it's theirs. But if I wanted to just, put my closet on the street, that wouldn't be acceptable behavior. Mm-mm. And so our changing use around curb space and who owns the curb and who accesses the curb and who touches the curb is all stuff that really drives how we think about community and how we think about land use and how we think about value. And so we could absolutely do a super deep dive on the MUT. I think Quorum would never invite me back if that's all we talked about, though.
It's a fascinating question, because I think that the lens of COVID in particular has really highlighted topics that we probably have been already talking about for a really long time, but it's brought them to light in a way that's just it's a little bit more unavoidable in the current environment.
So true. And it's funny, I was reading something just on Twitter the other night that said, there are, dozens of master's and PhD students who have spent years debating the definition of the word infrastructure.
Yeah.
And right now,
it means everything.
They're like, oh my God, it's my moment to shine. And I like to joke, transportation to some is not the sexiest, but I think it's pretty great. But to see our world wrestle with some pretty fundamental questions about, is water infrastructure, is broadband infrastructure, really means that we're moving towards a place where people have a bigger understanding of what government does for you.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Quorum really tries to do is give people more access to what is the secret sauce of government, and to open some of those doors. And I think I've seen already that COVID has allowed people to have time and thoughtfulness behind, well, how do decisions get made? Why are they getting made? And how do we access information that helps us either make the right choice, to support, to advocate, to change any of those decisions?
Well, the biggest hard-hitting question I have for you is, how long is it going to be Infrastructure Week? Do we think it will be years, centuries?
Listen, be still my heart. May it always be Infrastructure Week. Now, with that said, there's that double-edged sword, which is like, how do we actually pass something?
Yeah.
And I think the reality is, if you had told me a couple, in 2016, what would happen in the election and what 2017 through 2020 would look like, I may not have believed everything you told me. I certainly wouldn't believe some of it. But one of the things that has stayed the same is that everybody loves infrastructure and that it is truly bipartisan. And one of the things I learned early in my transportation career was I worked, when I was at USDOT, I worked for Secretary Ray LaHood, who was a Republican member of President Obama's cabinet. And Secretary LaHood wrote a book on bipartisanship, actually, that I very much recommend.
Yeah.
And it talked about how bipartisanship has transformed in the decades since he came to Washington. And that really his thesis is a little bit that technology and fundraising and all of these things have changed the onus of bipartisanship. But what he talks about in the book is that transportation, there's no Democratic roads or Republican bridges, that people are people and they need to continue to access. And I think the thing that will be very interesting to watch in the coming months is how much does that hold true for both parties and how much of it sort of becomes a little bit of a political landmine. I think there's a little bit of both. It's a big year for transportation policy because we also have to reauthorize our surface transportation program, which in many cases is in some ways like a bigger lift than an infrastructure package. And so I think it's definitely going to be infrastructure week for a couple more weeks, Ashton.
It's my hard-hitting question for it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
So Sabrina, you started talking about how Zipcar is a mission-driven organization, and I'm curious if kind of the challenges around both pros and cons around being a mission-driven organization when you're starting partnerships. Like, has that ever been something that, I imagine it's a really strong entrance, right? Because like, this is what we care about, this is what we're here to talk about. But then there's the other side of the coin where it may sometimes make things a little bit more difficult. Do you find that at all?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that if I've ever seen it. I think the only time in which it's a little more difficult is that we do come to the table with an opinion. Yeah. Right? We believe car ownership is inefficient. We believe car ownership is not the way to build a successful and sustainable future. And so there are some cases in which that's seen as a really evocative perspective. My job and the job of our entire team is to sort of say, well, here's why car ownership is all of these things that we know it to be, which is too expensive, a hassle, a burden, and also just like economically and socially inequitable. And then to sort of drive a partnership towards that. With that said, I think everyone comes to the table with their own set of personal biases. And it's funny when I used to play a game. Well, I only did this once because I got yelled at, but I came home from working when I was at USDOT. I came home one year for Thanksgiving. My brother was still in high school at the time. And I said something along the lines of, does anyone know what the gas tax is? And like, I got a glaring look from my mother who was like, I made this nice meal. I put all this food on. My father was he had an electric turkey carver.
The ones that like, yeah, with the, yeah.
And he loved that thing. Let me just tell you. So he's standing there holding his electric turkey carver, and he sort of turned to me and was like, "What?" And I'm pretty sure my brother was like, like had headphones in, not listening, whatever.
Usual.
Right. Transportation is very personal. It's very local. When you ask people, "What do you get for your money?" they always say, "I don't know. What have they done for me lately? There's a pothole down the street."
Yeah.
It's the classic pothole example, right? Yeah. Like, God, there's this pothole and it hasn't been fixed, or the traffic light's out, or this. And so part of the question is we sort of think about what's challenging. Is it what's challenging for you in your life? Is it a pothole? Is it that your subway was late? Or is it what is challenging for us as a nation? And that there's a little bit of a divide there.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit. Are you a West Wing fan? I'm assuming most people in like the universe that we all operate in, they are, but it reminds me of like, there was an episode in the first season where Bartlett was talking about how friends are honest with each other. And I think like coming in, acknowledging that you have an opinion is very similar.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. I'll use that. Zipcar is your friend and we're going to be honest with you.
If you can tie anything back to a West Wing episode. It's a big block of cheese day, any of it.
Oh my God. It's a really great escape from a bad day, I will say.
Yes, it definitely is. It's a good background show.
Absolutely.
So pivoting a little bit to sort of measuring success.
Yeah.
And I say this very respectfully of the federal government, but it tends to move a little bit slower, particularly when there's some partisan gridlock happening. I imagine measuring partnerships on the local level looks different than even on the state or the federal level, just because you're looking at a success time frame that's really different. Do you find that you're measuring success differently depending on the focus area of each partnership or the locality level?
Yeah, it's funny. It's actually one of the things I love the most about working at the local level is that, like, your constituents, mayors like to joke, and Secretary Buttigieg has actually said this, like, mayors are used to being at the grocery store and having a constituent come up to them and sort of give them their opinion on why they screwed up the budget in the cereal aisle.
Yeah.
Right. And, a lot of mayors have said, like, you just have to be ready for it because these people are your neighbors. These people are your constituents. These people, like, love you and know your kids and your wife and part of being an executive at that level means you need to have a bias towards action. Because if there's a problem in your city, you don't have the luxury of waiting 6 months, 8 months to act on it. You're expected to fix the problem and fix it quickly. And so what partners can do is step up and be part of that solution, which is, oh, there is a problem in X, or we are seeing not enough mobility coverage in this neighborhood, or we've seen car ownership go through the roof, or we're putting in a new development and they want to build too much parking. Like, what do you do? And I think the metric for success is how quickly do you engage? How quickly do you action around what are the levers to evoke the change you're looking for? And then obviously, like, you measure that and see if it works, and then you follow it up. The next step to all of that is, do you replicate it? So if adding a Zipcar in this location or buying memberships for this community helps fix this, the real burden of change is on how often do you replicate it? And I think that that's what comes back to sort of best practices and networking and all of that, which is, once you've learned that something works, how quickly can you grow that? Can you share that?
I'm curious if kind of the repetition or the replication of success has been impacted at all by COVID. Like, when you're seeing something working, does it mean, and I'm saying this with the hope that very much COVID will eventually be something we talk about as a period of time. I think we're all moving in that direction, but have you found that has impacted the rate that you're able to sort of replicate those successful partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, look, we, last year when COVID hit, we saw dramatic change overnight, as we should have, and as was appropriate for public health. Yeah. What has happened since then is a growing demand has really come back, where people are saying, I value access over ownership. I want to be able to get out of town. I want to be able to get to see people that matter. I want to be able to do things. I want to be able to sort of safely spend some time outside of the urban core. And I think we've had to be really nimble throughout that. At the end of the day, though, when you work for a transportation provider, like, safety is number one. Mm-hmm. And so you have to sort of pause on some of the iterative smaller changes to ensure you're getting the fundamentals right. Yeah. And I think that's been a lesson, which is, if at the end of the day your business model doesn't make sense, if at the end of the day your fundamentals are not strong, then the partnership can't, survive. And I think the last year has shown a lot of people that the base business case has to be there and has to be strong enough to withstand some really dramatic shifts.
Yeah. You mean the infrastructure of the business? The base?
Yes.
I thought I'd try for a pun, but I'm sure I could hear eye rolls on this.
Yes, I know.
So there was actually a question, and I'd love to have you expand on this one a little bit. Kind of the public partnerships with affordable car use and low-income families. Like, I'd love to hear you chat about that a little bit more. I think that's fascinating.
Absolutely. So we know that the income inequality associated with car ownership and the burden of car ownership is something that plagues different communities very differently. And that for some, cars are luxuries, and for some, cars are the fundamental access point to work, to life, to jobs, to healthcare. As I said, we have an opinion on that, which is that they shouldn't be, full stop. But we also acknowledge that there are trips that have to be done in a car, and there are access points that can't be reached in other ways. And so what our goal is, and we've done this in a couple of different places. I mentioned our Sacramento example. In New York City, we have a partnership with the New York City Housing Authority. What you may not know about New York City is that 1 in 10 New York City residents lives in public housing. 1 in 10.
I would not have gotten to that number.
Yeah, and it's a significant part of the walk of life in New York. And so we sort of said to ourselves, if 1 of 10 New Yorkers lives in public housing, why don't we have a dedicated program there? So we built one. So we park cars at NYCHA properties. We work with public housing residents to make sure that they can join, whether that is a question of internet access or not. We partner to make sure that those hourly rates are things that are more achievable for someone who lives in public housing. And we even do things to sort of make sure the community understands why that Zipcar parked on their property is a part of their community. Because I think that that's another big part of here about equity, which is don't just assume, but sort of ask. And when we see that these cars are doing well, and we see that there's interest, and we're able to tell that story, which says, there are 1,000 people that live in this building, there are 20 parking spaces, one of them goes to a Zipcar. It goes to the Zipcar because those 1,000 people can all use the car. And so I think that that's been something that's really driven us forward. Certainly that's something I'm looking into in a bunch of other cities. We've been thinking about it because we think it's really a fundamental, access is a right. And that's something that we really want to continue to grow.
On the piece you just mentioned too about the internet access to then book the car in the first place, that comes back to the question of like, what is essentially an infrastructure right? What is a utility in that same sense?
Yep. And exactly, right? If 1 in 10 New Yorkers lives in public housing and your public housing doesn't have good internet infrastructure, then how are you homeschooling children for a year, right? Those are sort of the fundamental questions that like I could talk about all day, because I think that they really help to build our cities and our culture and our characters.
Also a question too of even like the sanity side of it, like how are you both doing that and then also giving yourself a break to watch an episode of The West Wing or whatever it may be, right? There's just so many other factors that impact,
Exactly.
which is huge. So a question that we got earlier and that I completely skipped over, which is absolutely my fault, is margarita mobility. Is that something that you could elaborate on?
You know, I have to say that there are a couple people in mind who asked this question. I see it's anonymous, and I will find you after, because I can only imagine a couple people who would have asked this. I think that this is probably a reference to one of two things, so I'll talk about both. One was I gave a speech once about how mobility was really no different than being at Chipotle.
Mm-hmm.
And the second example I used was building a cocktail. So my favorite. And for those of you who haven't maybe heard this before, what I meant by that is that mobility is a set of choices. And for far too long in this country, we've deferred to just driving a car that we own everywhere, all the time, without any thought. And I said, truly, mobility is about building your own experience, building your own burrito, making your own margarita. I like mezcal and I like salt. Ashton, you may not like those two things. That doesn't mean that we can't both build a package that suits our needs.
Yeah.
Now, what does that have to do with mobility? First of all, safety first. Do never drink and drive. Yep. With that said, this idea that like I want to walk to the train station a couple times a week, but I also want to take the bus when it's raining because it stops outside my front door. And that when I go to visit my mom, who lives in the suburbs of Maryland, I'm going to need to drive because I can't walk the 45 miles to go see her. And then when I go to visit family in California, I'm going to take a plane. Those are actually decisions that we make all day, every day. But sometimes it's hard for us to make them on the micro scale. Like we've run out of milk. My son needs milk. So obviously I'm going to go to the grocery store. But if the grocery store is 3 blocks away, if you own a car, it's very easy to just get in the car, drive the 3 blocks, drive back 3 blocks. But if you don't own a car, you're forced into this decision-making tree that says, do I walk? Do I ride a bike? Do I scoot? Does someone else who's coming home and swinging by make the trip? Does my neighbor do it? Do we order delivery? Whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And so Margarita Mobility, or Chipotle Mobility, is really about this idea that like you need to have access to the buffet to make your own choices.
Yeah.
And that the best thing cities can do is make sure you have as many options in front of you as is humanly possible.
I think that's great. I think even about the milk example of like, does the weather even impact? Like, is it too hot or too cold to go out? Like, there's like kind of an infinite number of like micro decisions that have to happen.
Absolutely.
I'm a spicy margarita gal, in case.
Me too.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, we'll have to do that once we, can.
Yes, that'll be lovely.
Yeah.
So another question that we had from the illustrious Cyrus was, when will we get 3 lanes on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway? Which to me is slightly off topic, but Cyrus has lots of questions about that.
Cyrus also is really just upset that he can't be a panelist because he also believes he has the solution to congestion on the BW Parkway. And I know he is sitting there laughing that I'm calling him out on this because his solution makes no sense and will not work, which is why you can't speak at a webinar, Cyrus. Cyrus, the thing that you need to know most about the BW Parkway is that widening roads does not alleviate congestion. Let me say that one more time. Widening roads or adding lanes does not make the traffic go any faster. And it's a common misnomer, including by my brother, that if we just had more lanes, everything would be better. And the reality is that adding more lanes does what we call in the biz, induce demand. Induced demand is the opposite of what Zipcar stands for. Induced demand is this idea that like when you have a car, when it's super easy, when it's cheap, when it's right there, you don't think about it and you just drive. And at Zipcar, our mission is actually to force you to make that decision, to stop and say, if I'm going to get in a car, I'm going to have to reserve it by the hour. I'm going to have to bring it back to where it started. I have to sort of walk to the car. I got to pick up the car. And we're trying to make it difficult to be in a car because we want you to ask, do I really need to take this trip in a car? And the answer for the vast majority of trips, in our opinion, is no. You should be able to walk, bike, scoot, take transit. Now, Cyrus, if he was here, would make the argument that like he can't scoot down the BW Parkway. That's true. With that said, I'd make the argument that there are probably many trips on the BW Parkway that are happening single occupancy that should be happening several occupancy. And that is how you speed the Parkway.
You addressed that very diplomatically. I thought that was really well done.
Thank you. I have many decades of experience addressing him diplomatically.
You got another question about a protected bike lane on Columbia Road, but you don't have to answer that one.
I also feel like this is becoming a little bit of like an ANC town hall, like, Sabrina, what have you done for me lately?
Yes.
What I'll say is, and you mentioned this in my bio, I'm a survivor of a hit and run. I was out for a run one morning and a driver who was speeding hit me and left the scene. And I'm very, very lucky. I survived. I recovered. I had several surgeries and 2.5 years of physical therapy where they taught me how to walk again and how to run again and all of those things. But when it comes to safety on our streets, I am the loudest fan. I'm the biggest advocate. I'm on the steering committee of our Family for Safe Streets here in DC because to me, it's personal. It's professional too, but it's personal. And so yes, Greg, we should build protected bike lanes everywhere, not just on Columbia.
Yeah. So taking a step back and kind of thinking about, you've been in business as an organization for such a long period of time, and you've got these partnerships across the country. And I may be asking you to like pick a favorite child here, but do you have a partnership in particular that you're really proud of, or is one of your favorites, or kind of one that you would want to brag about a little bit?
Well, I feel you're so nice to ask because I feel like I sort of did that with New York and with Sacramento and BTA and MARTA and all those places. I will, shout out to the fact that there are small ones that I love and big ones that I love. Zipcar was founded in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're still there. Our headquarters is in Boston. And so it's really nice to be able to see that after 21 years, like we are still growing in that kind of way. Mayor Marty Walsh, before he became Secretary Walsh, His last announcement as mayor of the city of Boston was about our expansion with them. We added a bunch of more spaces, we added net new neighborhoods, we looked at equity, and we did all of this. And it's something that we worked with him and his team on for years. So it was really nice to see that sort of hit broad light right before he became the secretary. But I think that part of what we've seen there is that's a program that started as pilot and went into permanent. And for me, it's always a win when we can sort of say, oh, we have this crazy idea we're going to try, but then to actually have it be its like own grown-up idea that lives on, that's clutch.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Again, being mindful of secret sauce here.
Yeah, totally.
What do you think is next for partnerships for you? Like, what do you want to be doing with these public partnerships, these wonderful relationships that you have on the local level? What do you want to see next from them?
So I think the heat is really on for cities right now, to be honest with you. The pandemic changed a lot and people are really rethinking the way they move around, where they live, how they access, how they travel, how they keep their families safe. And for me, I want to be partnered with cities who acknowledge that they have to combat car ownership. Mm-hmm. That allowing 81% of their city to buy a new car, 41% of their city to buy two, some of the statistics that we've heard, is not an option. And that the world that we're building is made one decision at a time. And that if you allow your residents, the folks who sort of live and breathe life into your city, to say that I have to buy a car in order to live my life, you're signing up for typically 20 years. Because a car, as we all know, is not a short-term purchase. And even if it's short-term for you, the average car sort of has a life cycle of around 20 years. So let's say you're done with it after the first 7 and you sell it, it lives on and on and on well past you. Yeah. So for every new car that we sort of buy today, we're making a decision for the next 20 years of our community.
Well, that speaks to like the opportunity to expand these partnerships into so many different places, right? You go to the private route and you're dealing with the benefits for organizations where they can then participate with like having some sort of cash back for somebody to use transportation options like a Zipcar. Like there's just, imagine like the possibilities. It's quite the web of options to take it from there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I think will be really interesting is to see what happens to the future of the workforce.
Yeah.
And if people stop commuting to an office 5 days a week and instead set 1 day a week aside for site visits, this happens a lot actually with architectural firms and engineering firms that are members of Zipcar. This idea of like the business comes to you to see progress on a project. Like if you're not commuting every day, but you do have to go out and visit a construction site, what does that look like? Does your company become a Zipcar member and allow you to do that? That's something we see today. I think that option and that flexibility is only going to grow.
I'll make sure to go back to Quorum with that one too as we continue.
Oh, please. Yeah.
That's great. It'll be a good quote from the webinar.
There you go. Yeah, tell Alex I send my deep regards.
Yes, I definitely will. Well, I think on that note, I wanted to say thank you. We've got about a minute left here. And we really appreciate you spending time talking through these really fascinating partnerships, kind of what it takes to build them. Is there anything that you want to make sure we leave with in terms of kernels of wisdom around like how to build a partnership? Any last word that you want to end on?
I think I'd end by saying partnerships are about people and you want to be intentional. And the thing I'm most proud of at Zipcar is that we're very purposeful in how we engage with others. And that by putting our mission first, by putting our partnerships first, we're really there and we're really proud of the progress that we've been able to unlock. And so while Quorum is a tool, I think you also have to remember that tools are not enough to get you across the finish line. You need people who use the tools, who make the change, who make it all possible.
You and I talked a lot at the beginning before we started the call, how like at the end of the day, public affairs, partnerships, relationships are the things that drive progress. Tools take the knucklehead stuff off of the to-do list. People are the driver, literally drivers. Again, proud of my pun, they're the drivers of change.
I'm clapping for you. Very well executed. You got a couple in today.
Oh, thank you. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Just off the top of my head. But genuinely, thank you again. And thank you for everybody that joined us. We so appreciate it. And we're almost at Friday. And
Ashton, listen, if anyone has more questions or wants to follow up, feel free to share my email.
Perfect. And I'll also share the link to the book that you mentioned from Ray LaHood.
Sounds great.
Thank you
Have
again.
a great rest of your day.
Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.